Hi, everybody. I'm Linda Solomon Wood. I'm the editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer. Good evening. Hello. If you're joining us from the East, good evening. If you're joining us from the West, good afternoon. I'm so honored and thrilled this evening to have Noam Chomsky as my guest. And it's great to be here together at home with all of you. So welcome. Noam, our topic tonight is, can we emerge from COVID-19 with a new economy? And if so, how?
Well, there's the usual class war is operating right now. There are people, basically those who call themselves the masters of the universe, who are already trying to plan the future economy. There's another group, the general population, who are at the moment more quiescent. If that continues, then the first plan will be implemented. Their plan is to reconstitute the economy pretty much the way it's been under the neoliberal period, roughly the last 40 years, but harsher, with more controls over people, more means of more authoritarian measures, more efforts to ensure that there's no interference with this model. We see that in many ways. I could run through them. This is a good opportunity to ask questions, raise questions about what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a very different world? Do we want to live in a world where things like the pandemic don't happen? And remember that although we're right now suffering from the pandemic, it's not the main crisis by far. We will sooner or later escape from the pandemic at severe cost. We are not going to escape from the melting of the polar ice caps, the rise in sea level, the other extremely harmful consequences of global warming. Now, the ones who, well, it varies, but the major country in the world, the most important country, the United States, happens to be in the hands of someone, and in fact a party, that wants to exacerbate the crisis, wants to ensure that the coming crisis, which may well end the prospects for organized human life, they want to make sure that it's as severe as possible and as imminent as possible, and are putting all their efforts into that right as we speak. Can easily give examples. If we want that to happen, we can watch and not react. Canada's hardly blameless in this. There are many other problems. Do we want to have a world in which people have to live paycheck to paycheck? In the United States, that's estimated at maybe 60 or 70% of the population. That's the result of policies of the past 40 years, generally called the neoliberal programs. They are designed so that wealth is very sharply concentrated in very few hands. The United States happens to be somewhat extreme, but others are not all that different. In the United States, before the crisis, 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% of the population had about 20% of the country's wealth, and about 50% have negative net worth, liabilities greater than assets, and can barely get by if anything goes wrong. That's not a necessity. Those are specific policies, and those policies can be changed. In fact, it's not utopian to think that we could go back to a period before Reagan, Thatcher, and the rest, in which they were different and you had different consequences. So, for example, if you look at, I don't know how much detail you want, but yes, we can make a very different world. We can start doing it right now. So, for example, there's a stimulus program in that the Republican Congress has passed. So take a look at it. For example, let's take something that happened this morning. Okay, it gives you a good example. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, who's really the guiding hand, he's the thinker in the administration, the real evil genius, came out and said that the stimulus program cannot give money to states, as he put it, the blue states. It's not going to be a blue state bailout. No money for places like New York that vote Democratic. And the reason he said is that we're not going to, the future generations don't have to pay for the mistakes that these states have made in the past. The mistakes are that they granted pension plans for police and firefighters and teachers and others. And if they want to waste their money that way, we're not going to pay for it. Now, let's look 1 inch away at the stimulus plan. Who are we giving money to? Enterprises like, say, the airline industries, which have spent the last year gorging themselves on super profits and using it not to benefit consumers, not to build up the industry, but on stock buybacks to raise profits for investors and crucially for managers and CEOs. How much did they spend that way? About $45 billion. What are they getting in the stimulus? $50 billion. So in other words, if the rich and powerful in the corporate sector want to misspend their money by enriching themselves, we'll pay them off. But if states misspend their money by giving pensions to working people, tough luck, we're not going to give it to you. That's the mentality of the administration. It's a level of sadism that is hard to describe, although it has a very clear class basis. You can see it very clearly. If you want another illustration, just kind of telling, have a look at the federal budget proposal that the Trump administration submitted on February 10th. February 10th, the pandemic is raging and people are dying. Hospitals can't keep up. What's the budget? The budget proposal is to continue the cuts in health-related parts of the government, to cut back further on the Center for Disease Control. Trump, throughout his term, has been regularly cutting it back. And in the midst of the pandemic, let's cut back more, but not cut back everything. Let's increase the subsidies to fossil fuel industries. What are fossil fuel industries doing? Undermining the prospect for organized human life. And of course, let's have more funding for the bloated military, which outweighs most of the world. And of course, for his famous wall, to keep those rapists and murderers from coming across the border near where I live and murdering all white. That's the mentality of the administration, which in fact is just an extreme version of the mentality of the Republican Party, which drifted off the rails years ago. It's no longer.
That's so interesting, Noam. And when we were talking before we got started tonight, you said a couple of things that really, I think, are probably going to stay with me for the rest of my life. You said that, I was asking you about a tweet that I had, or a headline I had seen where you said, I believe you said something like, voting for Trump would be worse than voting for Hitler, or worse than voting for Hitler. And you just said back to me, that Trump is maximum, what did you say, maximum sadism, like worse than, you said he was worse than Hitler.
Well, I think it's obvious. I've been saying it for years. It's now become utterly transparent. Let's take a look. Hitler was maybe the worst criminal in human history. He wanted to murder 6 million Jews, murdered my extended family, 30 million Slavs, all the Roma, the homosexuals, others. That's pretty evil. But what does Trump want to do? He wants to destroy the prospect for organized human life. All, okay? And in the near future. That's what it means to maximize the use of fossil fuels, to cut back on all regulations that might diminish, restrict the danger. In fact, let's take a look at the documentary record. Probably the worst document that we know of from the Nazi era is the declaration in 1942, where they basically decided to kill all the Jews and conquer Eurasia and so on. Well, let's take the Trump administration. Okay, the most interesting document that's appeared there, which barely was mentioned in the press, was about 2 years ago, a document produced by the National Transportation Agency, which was a long, I think, several hundred-page assessment of the environmental situation. And they concluded that by the end of the century, global warming will reach 4 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels. Now, that's taken to be catastrophic by just about every analyst. And they drew a conclusion from it. The conclusion was we should stop adding emissions controls. Okay, we should have no emissions controls on automobiles. And the logic is sort of clear. We're going off the cliff anyway, so why not have fun and make profit? Okay.
Right.
How does that compare with the Wannsee Declaration of 1942? Okay, you decide, not up to me. Okay, and we see this in every action. So it's not just global warming, but let's kill more Americans. So, for example, right in the middle of this crisis, the Environment Protection Agency, which is now a subsidiary of the corporate world, it used to be functioning, but the scientists have been thrown out and silenced and so on. So they decided to eliminate essentially controls on emissions from coal plants and others that send mercury into the waterways, pollute them, kill lots of children, and so on. So let's extend that. Why? We'll put some more dollars in our pocket. Okay, that's the deregulation. It goes on and on. They just cut back the Obama administration efforts to place limits on emissions. Although that's just harming people in the United States. You destroy
sorry to interrupt, but you are one of the world's most renowned and most respected social critics. I wonder, like, what advice you would have for, we're now up to 650 people on this call, like, what advice do you have for us and for, you know, for all of us of how to push back against the kinds of things you're describing?
Can do it. Done hard. Popular movements have done harder things in the past. First
Popular
of all,
movements.
Popular movements, activist movements, the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, changed the countries enormously. We're not the same as we were even 50 years ago. It's much more civilized societies. Okay, we can do this too. So take the fossil fuel industry. Take a look at oil prices, pretty low. The major United States, Canada, others could simply socialize the industries, buy them up, not that expensive, and put them out of business. That would be a great boon to the world. You can't do it in a day, but you can be cutting back on it and using profit the the resources you have to replace it by sustainable energy. How much would that take? There are careful estimates by very good economists about how much it would take to, how much would it cost to carry out policies which will basically control the enormous climate environmental crisis. You're not going to end it. We've already done too much damage, but to keep it within livable limits. Turns out it would be a small percentage, very small percentage of the mobilization for World War II. And we're much richer countries now. So is that feasible? Well, it's feasible. In fact, and this is only one of the major problems we face. There are others which people aren't talking about, but are just as severe. One of the contributions of the Trump administration to human life is to dismantle the arms control regime, which has offered some protection from terminal nuclear war. Anyone who's looked at the record will find that it's appalling. It's almost a miracle that we've survived.
Yeah.
Talk about it if there's time. So now Trump's decision is, let's make it worse. So last August, Trump dismantled the INF Treaty, which was established by Reagan, not a leftist. Reagan and Gorbachev reached Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which has significantly reduced the threat of nuclear war. Trump abandoned it. And to make it clear to the Russians or anyone else what he meant, immediately after abandoning the treaty, within days, he arranged to launch a missile that violated the treaty. That's saying to Mr. Putin, please develop weapons to destroy us. And that'll be great for the arms control industry, of the arms military industry. In fact, if you look at their pronouncements, they love it. They're getting a huge shot in the arm, enormous money to build weapons that will destroy everything. And then down the road, they'll get more money to try to build defenses against these weapons that we're encouraging others to produce. Next on the chopping block, just announced a couple of days ago, is the Open Skies Treaty. It goes back to Eisenhower, another radical. This Open Skies Treaty has again reduced the threat of accidental nuclear war quite significantly. So let's get rid of that. Next on the agenda, last in fact, is the New START Treaty. Which limits the number of missiles and nuclear warheads for Russia and the United States. Putin, not the most lovely guy in the world, I don't have to go into that, has been pleading with the United States to renegotiate the treaty. It's due early next year. The US, Trump administration won't do it. The trick that they're using to try to prevent it is to say, we want a broader treaty that includes China. That's a bad joke. Chinese nuclear facilities don't even come anywhere near the minimal level of the START Treaty. This is just a trick to use the yellow peril hysteria to try to prevent the signing of the New START Treaty. When that's done, we're done with the arms control regime. How serious is that?
It's so serious. It's so serious. And Noam, I have one more question for you before I start asking you questions from the crowd. We have a lot. We won't be able to get to as many of them as we would like, but I just wanted to, like draw you back to where we are right now and ask you, you have lived a very long, productive, amazing life. Just what is it like for you to see what's going on right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, and
Well,
how do you see the world in this moment?
I
Noam
told you
Chomsky.
before that your mother's about my age, and I suspect
Yeah.
she has the same memories I do. It's all bringing back memories of early childhood, the early 30s. The early 30s, you could see the beginnings of the rise of the fascist plague. Actually, the first article I remember writing was in 1939, right after the fall of Barcelona to Franco. And it was about the terrible shadow that's spreading over the world, seems inexorable. First, the Nazis took Austria, and then they took Czechoslovakia. Now they've got Spain. Where's it going to end? It seems like they're taking over everything. That's early childhood memories. There are others. I remember, don't want to waste time on it, but that's back at that point. There were two choices the world had to face. The Great Depression had an enormous impact, much worse than this, in fact, in a much poorer country. And there were two ways out. One way was fascism, spread over a lot of the world. Another way was basically New Deal style, welfare state style, democracy and liberalism. That was another way out. That was the way the United States took. Overcame depression, established a version of regimented capitalism, which was extremely beneficial to people. It's now being torn to shreds during the neoliberal period, but for a long time it was very effective. Those are the two ways out. We're in the same situation. Not exactly, won't be the same things, but we can either choose to make the world harsher, more brutal, to march on to short-range destruction, or we can overcome these problems by means that are readily available. Like, as I said, small percentage of the funding for the Second World War mobilization, a small percentage of that would be sufficient to get the environmental crisis under control, to ensure that human life and many other species can survive. Nuclear weapons, straightforward. No reason for them to exist. They can be cut back, sharply cut back, in fact, eliminated. Okay? And we could go on with other crises. The economic crises that lead to a world in which 0.1% of the population holds 20% of the wealth, and the others struggled a bit by for a week. No reason for that to exist. We know exactly how to end it. In fact, we've been through ways of ending it. Okay, we can go on, but those choices today are reminiscent of the early 30s.
Such huge choices. Noam, I have so many questions, and I see that the one that's been voted up to the top of the list is from Robert Hackett, and I just want to tell everybody, even though it's gotten so many votes up, I'm going to go to the second question because I feel it's such a good follow-up to what we've been talking about already, and then I'm going to get to Bob's question. This is from James Doyle. He says, I'm 14 years old. What do I do to take back my future?
Well, that's a very good question. And there's a very good answer to it. Take a look at who's on the front line to try to prevent the world from being destroyed by the Trump types. Young people. Take a look at the climate strike last October, very significant series of events. Who was out there on the front lines? Young people. Take one of the most dramatic events in my lifetime, which I think ought to be played in every classroom all over the world. The meeting of the Davos conference in January. The Davos conference are the ones who in fact call themselves the masters of the universe. CEOs of major corporations, big news media executives, commentators. They get together once a year in Davos to Switzerland, go swimming, tell each other how wonderful they are, and so on. The meeting opened with two talks, one after the other. One was by Donald Trump. The people at Davos don't like him too much. He's too vulgar for them. He disrupts their image of humanism. But they applauded him lustily because there's one thing he knows that they understand: how to pour money into the pockets of the very rich and the corporate sector. So he got enormous applause. It was a crazy rant if you look at it. He was followed by a young girl, Greta Thunberg, 17-year-old girl, who gave a quiet, factual speech, accurate, careful, describing the imminent crisis, eloquent, and she ended quietly saying, "You, the people out there, are destroying our hope for any life." She got quiet clapping, pat on the head, nice little girl, go back to school. That's the answer to your question. It's the Greta Thunbergs and the 14-year-olds whose world is being destroyed, and they're on the front line of trying to save it. And the older generation is betraying them, and they should continue to work energetically to make this clear. I stress again that the videotape of that opening of the meeting is a real classic. Tells you a lot about the world and about ourselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Noam. This question is from Robert Hackett, who writes for National Observer. Greetings, Noam. When I interviewed you for your National Observer article last year, you presciently said that both pandemics and climate change constituted threats to organized human society. But you also said that mass social movements could demand and mitigate climate change. Do you feel that the pandemic makes either of these outcomes, extinction or rebellion, more likely? What can we learn from the pandemic about organizing for a more climate-friendly economy?
That's very important. What we're seeing is many things. On the one extreme, we're seeing the Trump administration trying to increase the severity of the pandemic. I didn't talk about it much, but we could. On the other hand, we see really heroic people, the doctors and nurses on the front line. What they're doing is indescribable. They're trying to protect people, help people survive under hideous conditions without protective gear. Of course, the governments haven't given it to them. They've preferred to waste their money elsewhere. But they're on the front lines constantly, all over the world. In China, United States, Canada, everywhere. That's an indication of the magnificence of the human spirit. It's a model for what can be done. And there's much more. Around much of the world, including the United States, mutual self-help groups are organizing spontaneously, communities in which people just get together to try to help those in need, give food to elderly people who are secluded, help people who are in trouble, get them to the hospital, and so on. This is happening everywhere, sometimes in almost spectacular ways. The most extreme that I know happens to be in Brazil. The favelas in Rio, the slums, are miserable, hopeless places. You can't ask people to wash frequently because they don't have water. You can't sequester because they're all packed into a small room. The government won't help them. They're like the United States. no, we don't help you. It's not our business. But there is a group that's organizing to provide some help for them. You know who it is? The crime gangs that have been terrorizing the community. They're now getting together to try to help people in the miserable slums to try to survive this. You see things like this all over the world. There's something else happening on the international level. There's a progressive international is being formed. That's the name. It's to have its first meeting in November. It was initiated by Bernie Sanders in the United States and Yanis Varoufakis, wonderful economist, former Greek Treasury Secretary in Europe. He's the founder of the organization, the M25, a Europe-wide organization which is working to try to salvage what makes sense in the European Union and to overcome its deep flaws. So they're calling for a meeting of the Progressive International, which will bring together activist groups around the world. Also, crucially, bring in the global South, those who will suffer the worst from this pandemic. And what they're doing is hoping to counter something that's developing before our eyes and isn't discussed very much. A reactionary international, an international of the most cruel and harsh reactionary states, organized from the White House, which is heading it, including Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's, I don't have to describe him, he's even worse than Trump, doesn't do as much damage because it's not that powerful a country. He's in fact helping to destroy the world by wiping out the Amazon, which will have an overwhelming effect and horrible people effect within the country. It's all flu. It's not. Don't worry. Go out and go to your restaurant and so on. So he's part of it. Moving to the Middle East, the El-Sisi dictatorship in Egypt, the worst dictatorship in Egypt's history. The family dictatorships of the Gulf states, brutal, harsh dictatorships. Israel, which has moved so far to the right that you can't see it anymore, is right in the center. Moving further, Modi's India. Modi is working to destroy, demolish Indian secular democracy, institute a right-wing Hindu nationalist virtual dictatorship, crush Kashmir. In Europe, bring in Orban's Hungary, turning Hungary from wiping out Hungarian democracy, turning it to a dictatorship. Salvini in Italy, who gets his kicks out of making sure that ships, barges, little brutes sink in the Mediterranean, killing people fleeing from Africa in desperation. Other characters like that around the world. So forge that into an international. It's happening right now. It's the main geostrategic program of the Trump administration. So let's counter that with a progressive international. Well, can that be done? If you look at the level of states, it seems totally out of balance. You look at the level of people, that's not true. Most people in the world want what the progressive international stands for. So the question, and the answer to your question is, can they be mobilized to take over? I should say that the people who own the world are worried about it. Go back to that Davos conference I mentioned. It was very interesting. Usually every year it's just self-congratulation. This year the mood was different. The top people there recognized that the peasants are coming with the pitchforks, and we better do something about it. So the mood of the conference was, let's apologize for what we've been doing for the last years. Yes, we did bad things, we harmed people, but we now understand. So we're now going to be the gentler, more humane. We're going to be concerned not just with stockholders and executives, but with communities and the workforce. We're really nice guys, and trust your future to us. We'll take care of you. That was the mood at Davos. And they didn't bother telling us that we've heard this tune before. So in the 1950s, the tune was, from now on, corporations are going to be what was called soulful corporations, overflowing with human sentiments, wonderful, lovely benefactors of the human species, soulful corporations. Well, we've seen 60 years to discover how soulful they are. But the point is they're running scared. They see what's happening. The peasants are coming with the pitchforks. And
so interesting. I just wanted to let you know that we have a lot more questions. Dave Cuddy is asking, can you discuss any threats of BlackRock, the Wall Street investment firm that claims to be going green, yet is invested heavily into fossil fuels, manages trillions of the global economy? How concerned should we be that the Bank of Canada very recently appointed BlackRock as its advisor for a new quantitative easing program for corporations? How important is it to lobby the Canadian government to cut its ties with BlackRock?
Well, that's part of the creating the image of soulful corporations. They're not doing it out of love for the human race. They're doing it because they're being pressed to do it. They're under pressure to do it. Recently, there was a memo from JP Morgan Chase, biggest American bank, saying we're under reputational pressure. What does that mean? It means people are banging at our doors and telling us they don't like what we do. So we probably better cut back on the funding for fossil fuels. Okay, yeah, you can put one of the ways to, short of dismantling these institutions, which in my view should be done, but much short of that, lots of pressure can be put on them to turn them to become soulful, at least an image, and to improve things. And we can go way beyond that. But that's what you're describing is an indication of the significance of constant popular pressures. It's had a lot of effect. To give you an example, important example in the United States, take the notion of a Green New Deal. Some version of Green New Deal is essential for survival. A couple of years ago, it was just something to be ridiculed. Can't talk about that childish nonsense. Now it's in the center of the legislative program. How did that happen? Well, a small group called Sunrise Movement, group of young activists, turn back to the first question, young activists were pressing very hard to move this to Congress. They got to the point of sitting in on congressional offices. They were noticed at that point. They were backed by some of the young congressional representatives who came into office on the Sanders movement pressure, especially Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a couple of others. They were joined by Ed Markey, senator from Massachusetts, who's been interested in environmental issues. Now it's on the legislative agenda. You don't laugh at it anymore. Maybe it can be pushed through. Maybe we can survive. There's case after case like that. And we're familiar with it in the past. Take a look at the United States in 1960. Okay? It was one of the freest countries in the world. It also had anti-miscegenation laws, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to adopt them. It had federal laws requiring that federally government-supported housing had to be segregated, no blacks. Women were still legally treated under the initial laws of the founding of the country, which they took over from Britain, in which women were technically property, not persons, handed from the father to the husband. It had been eroded somewhat over the years, but it wasn't until 1975, after the pressure of the women's movement, that women were legally recognized to be peers. They had a right to serve on federal juries. We can go on and on. The country has changed enormously. Canada too. Didn't happen by magic. It was not a gift from soulful corporations or benign government. It came from extensive popular mobilization and action, which can change things and has in the past in many ways. We're a much more civilized world than we were not that long ago.
Thank you so much. We have so many good questions here. Mr. Chomsky, do you think the post-COVID-19 pandemic will create a more positive economical and social global world, or will it continue to be a downward spiral?
That's whoever the questioner is, that's up to you. The choices are there, just as in the early 30s, the choices were between fascism and liberal social democracy. There are those who are going to be struggling consciously to make it just a continuation of the neoliberal world with harsher texture. There'll be others like you who will be trying to change it in another direction. The ones who, for example, will be meeting at the Progressive International. The ones who carried out the climate strike last October. And the ones who are working constantly to make BlackRock shift its policies, to make JP Morgan Chase cut back on fossil fuel funding. What world will come out depends on the balance of forces.
Thank you. This question is from Maxine Kaufman-Lacusta. Maxine asks, you mentioned clean energy, but after viewing the recent documentary, Planet of the Humans, which convincingly argued that the fossil fuels required to produce short-lived solar panels and wind turbines, and for backup to these technologies, equal or exceed what's used currently from burning coal, oil, gas. Have we been misled by the environmental NGOs? What's your view on this?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Yeah, I think the question is, clean energy, is it kind of a, are we being duped that the clean energy like solar panels and wind turbines is actually clean because a documentary called Planet of the Humans convincingly argued that it's equivalent to burning coal, oil, and gas? I think I got that right, Maxine. You could correct me on the chat.
Solar panels and turbines is equivalent to burning fossil
burning oil, yeah, burning fossils, yeah. Have we been misled?
Couldn't have convincingly argued that because it's not even remotely true. I mean, there are costs to solar panels, like you have to dispose of them somewhere. You have to manufacture them, but that's not even remotely in the domain of what happens with the use of fossil fuels. I'd simply suggest to the questioners to look into the details of the matter more closely. In fact,
apparently Bill McKibben wrote an article debunking that, so maybe that's something the questioner could refer to. Noam, who has written widely on what a sustainable economy would look like? Is it even possible, a sustainable economy?
A lot of interesting work on this. Robert Pollin, an economist, a very good economist who happens to be a co-author of mine occasionally, has written extensively in great detail about how to develop a sustainable economy, which would also ensure that those who are losing their jobs as the fossil fuel industry goes out of existence will in fact have ways of being integrated successfully into a new economy. And he also points out that it'll be a much more livable economy. It isn't much fun to spend maybe many hours a week sitting in traffic jams. Be much easier to have, be much pleasanter life to have a decent mass transportation system. Instead of having huge electric bills, we could pay almost nothing, like I do. Have solar panels, essentially no electric bills. There are many ways to make the world much more pleasant to live in and not to be destroying it with the use of fossil fuels. Pollan has elaborated this in detail. If you
Robert Pollin, correct? Robert Pollin, is that the author?
Pollin.
Okay, a lot of people are asking for the...
He's the economist at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
Great.
Another one is Jeffrey Sachs, very good economist who is at Columbia, runs the Earth Sciences Institute. He's written extensively on it. Has a very long, careful article in the journal American Prospect, very good journal, a couple of months ago. It spells it out in detail, looks at the cost.
Thank you.
There's plenty of work on it. It's certainly within reach.
Sorry.
It is within reach, there's no doubt.
Thank you. And this question is from Senator Rosa Galvez. She asks, what are the three most critical changes that we have to apply to hyper-capitalism to induce major shift, for example, to a circular economy or to decrease growth? And there was a follow-up to that question, so I'm just going to ask you that as well. From Annabelle White, what would the world become if the institution of global finance totally collapsed?
What would it cost to do what?
What would the world become?
A global...
If the institution of global finance totally collapsed. So there, I just gave you 4 questions, I think.
I didn't hear the last words. If global what collapses?
Finance, the global economy.
Collapses? If it collapses? Well, there's no reason for the global economy could collapse with rotten policies on the part of governments, but there's certainly no reason for it. I mean, actually, we've been through worse pandemics than this. Take a look at what's called the Spanish flu a century ago. It was far worse than this, and in a much poorer country. And there were no means, nobody knew at the time how to control it. Did everything disappear? I mean, the economy's recovered, far worse. And now we're in much better shape to deal with it. What are the, I don't know if I can mention 3 things, but there are a lot of things that can be done to overcome not only the immediate crisis, but the causes of it. Let's take a look. I'll use the United States as the example for 2 reasons. One, I know more about it, and secondly, it's the most important country. So right now, there's a big stimulus bill being given. Almost no surveillance. Who knows who it's going to go to? We know it'll go to the rich and the corporate sector and so on. Does it have to be? Let's take the airline industry, which I mentioned. Now, suppose we decide to bail them out for their having spent the last years enriching themselves with stock bailout buybacks instead of building up the enterprises. Suppose we decide, okay, we'll do it anyway. It can be done with conditionalities, okay? Saying, you want some money from the government, you have to commit yourselves to never carry out stock buybacks, to never put your money in tax havens, which robs the public of tens of trillions of dollars, to put workers on the management board, to ensure a livable wage for all your workers, to pay some attention to the needs of passengers instead of investors and CEOs. We can put all of those conditionalities on. You don't want to meet them, get lost. We'll just take over the industry. You can do things like that. Is that utopian, incidentally? Not in the least. Before Reagan, all of this was law, and it was implemented. It's not utopian to say, let's go back to the law as it was implemented before the neoliberal assault. Not new. Can we go beyond that? Sure can. Let's think for a moment about the origins of this pandemic. Well, why did it ever happen? You go back to 2003, SARS epidemic. Scientists all over knew that it's very likely that another coronavirus epidemic is coming. They knew how to prepare for it, but it didn't happen. Why? Knowledge isn't enough. You have to have the institutional structure. So who could have worked on it? Well, there's the drug companies, enormous resources. We pour money into their pockets by protectionist measures like incredible patent protection, which is what's called intellectual property rights, a huge gift to enrich the drug companies. So they're overflowing with money that we've given them. They have a lot of resources. Could they take this up? No, because of something called capitalism, which says that what you're supposed to do is follow market signals, okay? Market signals are, you're not going to make any profit out of this. You don't make profit out of preventing a catastrophe a couple of years down the road. You make profit by selling something tomorrow. So they're out because of capitalist logic. Then comes the second question. Well, why doesn't the government step in? So when I was a kid, when your mother was a kid, one of the terrors of the world was polio. It was a real terror, I remember it. It was overcome by a government-funded program, which led to the Salk vaccine, which had no patents. Salk said, no, it's like the sun, I'm giving it away. Well, why not do that? Because of the neoliberal plague, which says the government's not allowed to help. Remember Ronald Reagan, government is the problem, not the solution. It's corporations that are solution. Of course, the government is the solution when they're in trouble and we bail them out and subsidize it. But when the population's in trouble, government is not the solution. Okay, that's the second part of the hammer. Neither of those is necessary. They can all be eliminated, okay, easily. Easy to think through the measures. Now we can go on. We can change the institutional structures that are driving us to disaster. It's all within reach.
No, that's great note. I cannot believe it, but we've already come to the end of our hour. That just flew by. It's so amazing to hear what you have to say, what you're thinking about things. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and today, if you're out here in the West. And stay safe, stay healthy. See you next time.
Good. Very good to be with you.
Thank you.